Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People's Story. I've lived in my neighborhood for 6 years now. It's a quiet suburban community where most people mind their own business while still being friendly enough to wave hello. I work as a paralegal at a mid-sized law firm downtown, which means I spend my days buried in legal documents and procedures. Never thought those skills would come in handy in my personal life until recently. Everything was peaceful until about 8 months ago when a retired police officer moved into the house 3 doors down from mine. At first, everyone was excited. Having a former cop in the neighborhood seemed like a good thing for security. The previous owner had been an elderly woman who rarely came outside, so seeing new life in the house was welcome. The retired officer introduced himself at the first HOA meeting after moving in. He made sure everyone knew about his 30 years on the force. He spoke about how he had cleaned up the streets and now wanted to maintain standards in our neighborhood. Some people found it charming. I found it a bit much, but kept my opinions to myself. Within 2 months, he had volunteered for the HOA board and was quickly accepted. There were always empty spots nobody wanted to fill, and most people were happy to have someone willing to take on the responsibility. The board consists of 5 members, and meetings were typically boring affairs about landscaping contracts and community pool maintenance. Things changed gradually at first. The retired officer started walking around the neighborhood with a little notebook, jotting things down. He would take photos of people's yards and properties. When questioned, he'd say he was documenting violations for the HOA records. It seemed excessive, but technically within the rules. I have a modest home with a front yard I'm particularly proud of. I've created a small garden with native plants that attract butterflies and hummingbirds. It's not elaborate, but it's well maintained and brings me joy after long days at the office. About 4 months ago, I was reading on my porch when I heard raised voices from my neighbor's house. Their teenager was having a birthday party. It was about 9:30 p.m., and our neighborhood quiet hours technically start at 9 p.m., but it was a Saturday and the noise wasn't excessive. I could hear music and teenagers laughing, but nothing outrageous. Then I saw the retired officer marching down the street, phone in hand. I watched as he stood in front of their house, pointing aggressively while talking on his phone. 15 minutes later, a police car arrived with lights flashing. I was surprised enough to walk over and see what was happening. The police officer looked annoyed when I arrived. My neighbor was standing in his driveway looking embarrassed while his son and friends watched from the doorway. "Sir, this really isn't an emergency situation," the police officer was saying. "In the future, please use the non-emergency line for noise complaints." The retired officer puffed up his chest. "I know what constitutes a disturbance of the peace. 30 years on the force taught me that. These people are violating clear HOA rules and disturbing everyone." I glanced around. No other neighbors had come outside. No one seemed bothered except him. The police officer looked uncomfortable. "Well, I've asked them to keep it down, but there's no citation issued. Please don't call 911 for HOA violations in the future." After the police left, I approached my neighbor to express support. He told me the retired officer had called 911 claiming there was a riot at his address. His son's party consisted of 8 teenagers playing music and eating pizza. At the next HOA meeting, I raised concerns about this incident. I think we need to clarify the procedure for handling noise complaints. Calling emergency services for minor HOA violations seems excessive. The retired officer glared at me. I was simply ensuring community standards were enforced. As someone with extensive law enforcement experience, I recognize when intervention is necessary. The other board members shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The meeting moved on to other topics. The following week, I received a violation notice in my mailbox. According to the notice, my garden plants exceeded the height restriction by 3 inches, and my decorative stone border extended 2 inches past my property line. The fine was $75, and I had 7 days to rectify the situation. I measured my plants and borders. Some plants were indeed a few inches over the limit, but they were flowering perennials that would naturally reduce in height after blooming. The stone border was exactly where it had been for years, and previous HOA inspections had never found issue with it. I decided to trim the plants but leave the stone border as it was, since I was confident it was within my property boundary. 3 days later, while I was watering my newly trimmed garden, a police car pulled up in front of my house. The officer approached looking confused. "Good afternoon. We received a 911 call about someone vandalizing property at this address." I was stunned. "I live here. I'm just watering my garden." The officer nodded. "That's what I figured. Sorry to bother you." As he turned to leave, the retired officer appeared from down the street. Officer, that garden border is encroaching on common property. I documented it clearly in my report. The police officer looked between us. Sir, this is a civil matter for the HOA. Please don't call 911 for this type of situation. After the officer left, the retired officer stood glaring at me. I know violations when I see them. Civilians like you don't understand the importance of maintaining order. That was when I decided enough was enough. At the next HOA meeting, I arrived prepared to address the issue again. The meeting room was in our community center, with about 20 neighbors in attendance. I raised my hand during the open forum. I'd like to discuss the appropriate use of emergency services for HOA matters, I said when called upon. The retired officer interrupted before I could continue. If you're referring to enforcement actions I've taken, I can assure everyone that my experience gives me unique insight into handling community violations. Calling 911 for garden borders and teenage birthday parties isn't appropriate use of emergency services, I responded. It potentially delays response to actual emergencies. I determine what constitutes an emergency based on my 30 years patrolling the streets, he said dismissively. This neighborhood is my beat now, and I won't have perps like you undermining community standards. Did he just call me a perp? Several neighbors looked uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. The HOA president, a timid man who worked in accounting, quickly moved to the next agenda item. After the meeting, a few neighbors approached me privately to say they agreed with me, but were hesitant to challenge an ex-police officer. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. The retired officer started conducting what he called security patrols around the neighborhood at odd hours. Neighbors reported seeing him walking around with a flashlight at midnight, peering into yards and taking notes. I received 3 more violation notices in 2 weeks. One claimed my garden gnome was positioned suspiciously and could be misconstrued as an offensive gesture. Another claimed my wind chimes created noise pollution. The third said my bird feeder was attracting suspicious wildlife to the neighborhood. Each violation came with increasing fines, and the notices mentioned that unpaid fines could result in liens against my property. I paid the first fine under protest, but refused to pay the others, sending formal letters contesting the violations. Then I learned something disturbing from another neighbor. She had seen the retired officer entering backyards to inspect properties, including mine. This was absolutely not allowed under HOA rules, which only permitted inspection of areas visible from public spaces. I installed a discreet security camera covering my backyard. 2 days later, I caught him on video, lifting my gate latch and entering my property with his notebook. He spent several minutes examining my shed and taking photos of my patio furniture. That weekend, my cousin came to visit. She parked in my driveway, completely on my property. Within an hour, a police car arrived. The responding officer looked tired as he explained someone had called 911, reporting an unauthorized vehicle creating a security risk. To my surprise, I recognized the officer. He had spoken at a legal seminar my firm had hosted about police procedures. "Officer, may I ask who reported this?" I asked. He glanced toward the retired officer's house. "I'm not supposed to say, but between us, it's the same person who's made about 25 911 calls from this neighborhood in the past couple months. The department is getting concerned about resource allocation." 25 calls? I was shocked. At least. Listen, I knew him back when he was on the force. Let's just say there's a reason he was encouraged to take early retirement. It wasn't entirely by choice. That was the information I needed to start building my case. Over the next 2 weeks, I went into full legal research mode. During lunch breaks at work, I requested public records of 911 calls from our neighborhood. I reviewed state laws about misuse of emergency services and trespassing. I thoroughly studied our HOA bylaws and regulations. I discreetly reached out to neighbors who had been targeted, collecting statements about their experiences. Many were initially reluctant, but seeing my organized approach gave them confidence to share their stories. I learned the retired officer had called 911 on an elderly couple for having their trash can out 12 hours early, on a family with young children for chalk drawings on their own driveway, and on a woman for having a political bumper sticker he disagreed with on her car parked in her garage, which he had entered without permission to inspect. I compiled everything into a comprehensive document with exhibits, timestamps, and references to relevant laws and HOA bylaws. I included statistics on average emergency response times and how frivolous calls impact those times. Through careful research, I discovered the retired officer hadn't served a full 30 years as he claimed. He had been forced into retirement after 22 years following multiple disciplinary actions for overstepping authority and harassment complaints. The final piece came when I spoke with the police department's community liaison about the proper protocols for reporting neighborhood concerns. When I mentioned our situation, she was already aware of it. The department had been tracking the unusually high number of calls from our area and was considering formal action. I asked if she would be willing to attend our next HOA meeting to discuss appropriate use of emergency services. She readily agreed, concerned about the pattern she was seeing. The night of the HOA meeting arrived. I had informed the HOA president that I would be presenting information about community safety protocols, being deliberately vague to ensure the retired officer would attend. The meeting room was unusually full. Word had spread that something significant would happen. I had asked several affected neighbors to attend, and they sat nervously around the room. When my turn to speak came, I approached the front with my binder of evidence and a USB drive containing the security footage. "I'd like to address an urgent community safety issue," I began. "Over the past 3 months, there have been 28 emergency calls to police from our neighborhood. 25 of those calls were for non-emergency HOA violations." I displayed the public record information showing the dates and nature of the calls. "According to state law, misuse of emergency services is a serious offense. Each non-emergency call to 911 can delay response to actual emergencies by an average of 8 minutes. The retired officer stood up. "I'm ensuring this community remains safe and orderly. As someone with decades of law enforcement experience, 22 years, I corrected, not 30 as you've claimed. And according to public records, your retirement followed 3 disciplinary actions for similar behavior in your former precinct." His face reddened. I continued before he could respond. "Our HOA bylaws specifically prohibit entering private property without permission. I have video evidence of unauthorized entry into at least 4 properties, including my own." I played a short clip showing him entering my backyard. Several neighbors gasped. "Furthermore, our bylaws state that board members must act in good faith and in the best interest of the community. Issuing fraudulent violations, harassing residents, and misusing emergency services violate that duty." The retired officer marched toward me. "You have no idea what you're talking about. I've been protecting this neighborhood from declining standards. These civilians—" "We're not civilians in this context," I interrupted calmly. "We're homeowners and your neighbors." The police department liaison stood up from where she had been sitting quietly. "I'm Officer Wilson from the Community Relations Division. Our department has serious concerns about the pattern of 911 calls from this neighborhood." The retired officer seemed genuinely shocked to see her. "Emergency services are strictly for emergencies," she continued. "Garden gnomes, properly parked cars, and children's birthday parties do not qualify. The department is considering charges for misuse of emergency services, which carries significant penalties." The room fell silent. The HOA president cleared his throat nervously. "Given this information, I believe we need to address this situation immediately," he said. "Our bylaws allow for removal of board members who violate their duties through a vote of no confidence." One by one, neighbors stood to share their experiences. The elderly couple who had been afraid to put their holiday decorations up, the young family whose children were now scared to play outside, the woman who found the retired officer in her garage examining her vehicle. When the vote came, it was unanimous among both board members and residents. The retired officer was removed from the board effective immediately. The HOA also voted to amend the bylaws to create clearer enforcement procedures and require documentation and second opinions before violation notices could be issued. The retired officer stormed out, shouting about declining standards and how we would regret undermining authority. The next day, several neighbors received new violation notices slipped under their doors. Not official HOA notices, but handwritten notes detailing supposed infractions. I called an emergency meeting with the new board and presented these notes as evidence of harassment. The board sent a formal cease and desist letter, and the police liaison officer personally visited him to discuss the consequences of continued harassment. 2 weeks later, a for sale sign appeared in front of his house. A month after that, he was gone. The neighborhood gradually returned to its peaceful state. We established a proper community watch program that works collaboratively with local police through appropriate channels. The HOA implemented transparency measures, including requiring photographic evidence and board review of all violations before notices are sent. My garden is flourishing again. I added new plants that attract even more butterflies and hummingbirds. The bird feeder still attracts suspicious wildlife, mainly cardinals and blue jays. The final irony came 3 months later when the retired officer's house sold. The new owner, a retired judge who asked at her first HOA meeting if she could help review the bylaws to ensure they were fair and legally sound. Sometimes standing up to bullies requires documentation, community support, and working through proper channels. My legal background certainly helped, but what really made the difference was neighbors finally feeling safe enough to speak up together. The long arm of the law works best when it's not overreaching. The next one is a pro-revenge story. UPS smashed a nearly new MacBook that I sent with them. I asked them nicely to pay me back for it, and they arsed about, blaming me, blaming my packaging, saying it was impossible they damaged it, etc. I was able to prove my packaging was flawless and get a statement from the Apple shop that I took it to say it was damage caused by being dropped, thrown. I could also prove it worked when I sent it. They weren't interested and messed me about for weeks, sending me from pillar to post, even threatening to make me pay interest on customs charges, which I wasn't liable for as the laptop was smashed on arrival and thus worthless at import. I took it to small claims. They hired a lawyer who sent me letters saying they contested it and would go for full fees, etc. if I lost. I went for it anyway. I did Law Stuff University, so I knew the basics, and I thought my case was pretty clear-cut. I won. I won my costs back, plus extra, plus interest. They ignored the court order and did not pay. Now, this laptop was originally being sent to my beloved mother-in-law. She asked me to help her with the problem, as UPS were also seriously harassing her for the customs fees. However, very unexpectedly, before I could resolve it, she passed away. It was the last thing she ever asked me to do for her. I loved that woman more than pretty much any human on this planet. She was my mother, my best friend, and my mentor. Taking down UPS was now my personal vendetta. I researched my options. I could have taken the usual, more conservative legal routes to reclaim my money. But no, fuck them. I don't care about the money anymore. I want revenge, I want drama, I want karmic justice. I went to the high court, I got a writ of control. I, of course, added on more fees and more interest. I then hired the most aggressive bailiff firm in London. I trusted that the shitty processes and attitude of UPS to mean they would ignore the letters and actually get a visit. They did. The bailiffs rock up at UPS headquarters and explain the situation. UPS refused to pay, so the bailiffs start listing goods. Security try to make them leave. The office manager tries to bully them out. Obviously, no shits are given by the bailiffs, and they crack on with their jobs. I wasn't allowed the body cam footage, but they did send me a detailed report. The final conclusion is copied from it below. Calls were then made to the accounts manager, who arrived in a hurry. As no payment was forthcoming from them, the agent again explained the removal process and costs involved and called the office for approval to begin removals. The agent began to seize assets. The finance director then arrived on the scene. He was not at all happy about the attendance, but ultimately agreed to pay a voluntary payment in full from his personal account in order to stop the removal. I know it's a drop in the ocean to UPS, but I got more than double what I originally asked for to replace the laptop. They would have had to pay even more on top in fees to the bailiffs. I reckon it cost them at least 3x more than the original claim in the end. But mostly I just enjoy the mental image of the flustered finance director and his impotent rage, having to pay his own money to stop the heavies taking desktop computers and fancy pot plants and things out of their swanky head office lobby. The next one is a malicious compliances story. 45 years ago, I spent a few months as a software engineer for a Midwest company that built industrial control systems, writing assembler for an embedded micro. Management had gone to a seminar on structured design, the latest software trend, and got religion. My manager, Jerry, called me into his office and asked to see my work. He was not a programmer, but sure, but whatever, here you go. I handed him my listing, about a half-inch thick, and forgot all about it. A few days later, he called me into his office, which always reeked of cigarette smoke. "You've got some work to do," he snapped, furious. I looked down at his desk, and my 8085 macro assembler listing was heavily annotated in red pencil, with every jump instruction circled. "This is now a go-to-list shop. You've got to get these out of here." "Jerry, this is assembler code. That's different from a high-level language. I don't want a bunch of goddamn excuses. You have 2 weeks. Well, shoot, this is ridiculous. I stared at the code for a while, then got a flash of inspiration and set to work. Every place there was a jump, conditional or unconditional. I put the target address into the HL register, did an SPHL to copy it to the stack pointer, then did a return, followed by a form feed and a title block describing the new module. The flow of control was absolutely unchanged, although with a few extra instructions it was marginally slower. The machine was controlling giant industrial batching equipment, so that wouldn't matter. I dropped the listing, now almost 2 inches thick, onto Jerry's desk and went home. He would either spot the joke and respond with anger, or hopefully be convinced that I had magically converted the program into a proper structured design application. Some of those title blocks were pretty fanciful. He bought it. Suddenly, I was an expert software engineer versed in Jordan and Constantine principles, and the application made it into distribution. Around the same time, I quit to work full-time on my engineering textbook and other fun projects and forgot all about it. Until about 3 years later, when I was pedaling across the United States on a computerized recumbent bicycle. I got a message from a new employee of the company who was charged with maintenance of the legacy system, and he was trying to make sense of my listing. I called him back from a payphone in Texas. He sounded bewildered. "Did you write this? What are you, I don't understand, what are you actually doing here?" There's only one thing you have to know," I said, then went on to relate the tale of Jerry and the structured design hack. By the end, he was practically rolling on the floor and told me they had long since fired that guy. He now shared my secret about virtual software modules and promised not to tell, but it's been almost a half a century, so I guess it's okay now. The next one is an entitled people story. Last week, I was in a horrible car accident. A truck rolled through a stop and we couldn't avoid the collision. All of the airbags deployed and my daughter was traumatized. Fortunately, no one was injured and we all walked away. At work the next day, my boss learned I didn't get evaluated after and called me an idiot. She said with my luck I'll have a stroke or an aneurysm, and that's when my light bulb turned on. I have a clotting disorder, literally the opposite of hemophilia, and didn't even remember until she said that. Y'all are going to call me stupid and say this is fake because what kind of bimbo forgets they have a clotting disorder? But let me put it in perspective. I have type 1 diabetes that is a daily pain in my ass. I have a severe cinnamon allergy, to the point that if I touch it, I have a moderate reaction for 24 or 36 hours, and if I ingest it, I'm miserable for 72 plus hours. I have general anxiety and PTSD, which means I work hard to maintain my mental health. Before my hysterectomy, my periods would have me completely doubled over in pain and unable to get out of bed. Pregnancy was not kind to me, and, on top of learning I have an enzyme deficiency that renders anesthesia useless, C-section with full sensation, it also damaged the right side of my heart. I have constant /neck/shoulder pain because I'm a very small woman with a G-cup chest. All this was well established before we learned only a few years ago about my factor VIII, so it's all very at the forefront of my conscience, but the anti-hemophilia tends to fade into the background until it becomes relevant. I messaged my doctor letting her know all the facts, that I'm fine, just a little banged up. Her nurse called me back and told me to go to the ER for a Doppler. Great. My community hospital is great. I love the doctors, and they have won several awards for the care they provide. The ER? Well, I wouldn't trust them with the care of a cactus. They're wildly incompetent and unbelievably arrogant. I had to threaten a nurse with assault charges to get her to stop touching me without consent. I was accused of drug seeking because I asked for pain meds after a second-floor deck collapsed under me and I was in a wheelchair. My friend was roofied, and I told the nurses that she needed a tox screen. She was unconscious and vomiting. I was with her the entire night, and she drank less than 4 drinks over a 5-hour time period. They deemed that not to be cost-effective and decided she needed a CT and a biblical lecture on making better choices. I'm a compliant patient and take my health very seriously, so I went to that god-awful ER. They had just finished my Doppler, and I told the tech that I needed juice, type 1 diabetic. She gave me the call button and told me a nurse would be in soon. I waited a few minutes and pressed the call button. Explain I'm a diabetic with a low sugar and need juice, to which I get the incredibly helpful, okay. About 10 minutes later, I'm still sitting there juiceless. So I repeat the process, button, explain, okay. Another 5 minutes and in walks registration. I tell her that I need juice and she walks out for a moment, then walks back in with a nurse. The nurse also has no juice. Where is the juice? Is there an evil warlock HOA arding all of the juice? Did POTUS sign an exec order banning it? Juiceless nurse checks my blood sugar and it is indeed low at 51 mg/dl. And then she appears, my angel of salvation. She walks in with 4 ounces of orange juice. It's a start, but with the juice shortage, I'm willing to take what I can get while they quest for more. She makes sure I have the call button and tells me to press it if I need more. Spoiler alert, I needed more. I press the call button and repeat the process. Button, explain, okay, crickets. 5 minutes later, I try again, but this time my call is ignored. 10 minutes later, I've had it. My vision is starting to distort, and I'm experienced enough to know that means the threat of seizure looms on the horizon. I try one last time to get help. It's like they rehearsed it, everything played out exactly the same. So I put my shoes on, grab my purse, and leave. A nurse asks me all cheerful if I'm leaving, and I'm stumbling as I explain that I need juice or glucose or candy or whatever, and they refuse to help me. Her excuse? We're very busy. And all 5 nurses standing at the counter of the nurses' station nod in agreement. Then, she says what may be the shittiest statement possible in this situation. "But you're welcome to leave." Excuse me? You, a medical professional, allegedly, want to send a diabetic seizure risk with documented low sugar away from a medical facility? I'm sorry, is there more to the juice shortage and you can't risk a possible leak? So I left. I drove home and chewed about 12 glucose tabs before my sugar normalized again. But now, in the light of frontal lobe health and the certainty of the juice shortage, I need to ask if I was the entitled Karen. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.